Hi, everybody. I'm Carolyn Hymas, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm the Associate Director of Alumnics and Family Engagement, and I just want to thank everybody so much for joining us today for our talk, California AB5, Everything You Need to Know as a Creative. Before I proceed any further, though, I want to let everyone know that we will be recording our discussion today. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please send them in the chat box, and we will also have time for Q&A at the end of the discussion. Before we actually get started and get into the meat of what we're doing, I just want to share an update with everybody. In the next couple of months in Alumnics Engagement, we are launching an alumni platform. So excited. This has been a long time coming for our community. The system will house a directory so you can easily find one another and connect. It will also have a CalArts business directory. Our formal mentor program will be facilitated through this platform next year. And there will also be opportunities for informal mentorship connections too throughout the year. It will contain a professional development resource library for creatives. We are in the process of mapping out general resources over the summer that would be useful for everybody in any métier, regardless of what it may be. And then over the course of the year, we're going to develop more school and program specific resources as well. So this system is really great. It's also going to provide community and campus updates. So if you're curious about what the latest and greatest is that's happening at CalArts, it will have basically our news section too, which is really fantastic. And there will also be an events section, so everybody can share their shows, their upcoming happenings in the events section and share with the rest of the community. And it actually syncs with Eventbrite, which is so nice. So you don't have to like double up all your content. You should be able to just enter the Eventbrite ID and it should sync in with Eventbrite, which is really nice. And we are just really excited to have our alums be able to connect in just a more meaningful and deep way through this new tool that we are rolling out in the next couple of months. I have a couple of housekeeping items for all of the participants who are watching today. We have your mics turned off just for any ambient sound that might be coming through. And if you have any questions, please, once again, send them through the chat box. We'll be monitoring it. And that's all I have for you guys. So for updates and whatnot and housekeeping items. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers, Olivia Phillips and Sam Mazzio of the Southern California law firm, A Better Professional Corporation, or also known as Better for short. They both have extensive experience in labor and employment law, contracts, copyright, and much, much more. We're very excited for them to do this presentation for us.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to do a little bit more of an introduction of ourselves and my law firm, and then I will let Liv take it away. She is our labor and employment guru and is on the forefront of a lot of the amendments and comments and things going on with AB5. So a little bit more about myself and Better. Like we were introduced so kindly, we are a Southern California small boutique firm. We focus on nonprofits, small business, creatives, solos, and we really help from anything from A to Z pretty much. So that means contracts, getting your entity set up, helping with your board, helping with your trademarks, your copyrights, your contracts, through the whole process of that. And that all includes labor and employment. And then particularly and relevant for this particular workshop, that's also going to include sort of determining who's a contractor, who should be a contractor, what their contract should look like, and then of course, whether or not there is any risk in categorizing someone one way or another under AB5. A little bit of background, I actually worked at a nonprofit organization called Invisible Children. That was about 7 years ago now. They had the most viral video in history. You might remember Coney 2012. And then Liv actually joined the last firm that we had, Wilkinson Mazzio, and then joined me here at Better when we shut that firm down to create Better. And the whole point of creating Better was to do better by all of you, our potential clients, our community. And really what that means is more education and empowerment. So I will shut up and let us get to the education and empowerment.
Well, thank you, Sam, for that great intro. And I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to share my screen so that we can have our fun little PowerPoint. I'm not sure. I think that might have been sent out to everybody previously, so you might have seen it. Give me 1 second. Okay. Sam, could you just confirm that you can see this so I know that everybody is good to
I
go?
can. Yep, and the little slides down the left too.
Okay. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip through the first 2 slides because Sam did such a great job with the intro, and we're just going to dive right in. I have to imagine everybody here has some background on AB5, what it is generally, because it has been such a hot topic and it's been around at this point in some capacity. At least the test that we're going to go into, ABC test, has been here since 2018. Like the first bullet on this screen says, this AB5, the Assembly bill, was a codified ruling of the Supreme Court case known as Dynamics. It was a case about a shipping company and their independent contractors, and that was where we got this ABC test that was then rolled into AB5. Codifying, by the way, just basically means that there's already a court case or maybe multiple court cases, but the legislature decides they want to double down on what courts have decided and make it truly the law of the land by having some sort of legislative body decide that the law is not just through the courts, but it's also through this legislative body that's been voted in by the people. So it's kind of just, like I said, doubling down on what is already law to show that the people's elected officials also agree with what the courts have decided. So Codified Dynamics, we already kind of went through that. The ABC test is a test that's not new in general. It's already been used in Massachusetts and New Jersey, but it is incredibly new for California, which is partially why people are having such an issue with it. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Under the ABC test, a court is going to presume that a worker is an employee unless the person that's hiring the worker can show that that's not the case. And so to do that, we go through the ABC test 3 factors, the A, B, and C. So we'll go into those right now. The first factor, factor A, is whether or not the worker is free from the control and direction of the hiring entity. And before I go any further, I should mention that these 3 factors are kind of like sliding scales. There's no clear line of when somebody is going to fall on one side or the other of either being an independent contractor or an employee, which is another reason why people are having such trouble with this, because it's not at all clear. So for this first one, the worker is free from the control and direction of the hiring entity. One question that we get a lot around that is, well, if I'm hiring somebody to do something for me, I kind of have to direct what they're doing, right? And although, like I said, the line is kind of hard to find, this is how I generally would describe looking at this. When you hire somebody to, let's say, paint your house, you can tell that person, look, I want to paint my house this color. I want to paint it by this date. And maybe you even say what brand of paint you want to use. But generally, you leave it to the painter to decide what brushes they're going to use, maybe how many coats they have to do. At a certain point, you just assume that they are going to know what to do because they're the expert in what they're doing. And that's kind of the idea behind this first factor. If you are exerting a ton of control over the worker, that's less like they are an expert at what they're doing and more like they're an employee that needs your direction to make sure that the job gets done. So, like I said, sliding scale, the more control and the more direction the hiring entity has, the closer you're going to be to an employee-employer relationship. The less control you have, the more that you give the worker the latitude to decide how they're going to perform the overall work that you've decided you need from them. The less control you have, the more likely it is that they're contractors. So that's how we look at the first factor. The second factor, whether the worker performs work that's outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. So that one is usually, for all of the AB5 determinations that I have done, that's the trickiest one to get through. And This one is the trickiest, especially for creatives. We've worked with a lot of creatives who have nonprofit organizations that are hiring creatives to either put on assemblies or maybe teach classes and things like that. And this one is usually the hardest to get past. And that's because of that whole usual course portion. In California, I believe it was the EDD who has an example on their website that basically says that an example of what would be outside of the usual course of business is, let's say you own a store, a retail store, and you hire a plumber to come and fix something in the bathroom. That's going to be outside of the course of business, because the plumber is not providing whatever retail goods that you sell. They're providing a service that's totally unrelated to what you're selling. But on the other hand, an example of somebody who's going to be providing work that is in the usual course of business is, let's say you own a bakery. This is the example that the state gives. Let's say you own a bakery and you hire somebody to do cake decorating. Cake decorating is probably going to fall under the course of business of a bakery because they're baking cakes and decorating them, among other things. So in that case, that's going to lean way closer to employee, and you're not going to be able to classify as an independent contractor for that reason. Plumber, independent contractor. Baker that's decorating cakes, way closer to employee. And C is a little bit easier to establish, I would say, because there are clear-cut things that you can do to engage in an independently established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as the work performed. Another thing that particular FAQ that the EDD provided has said is one way to show that this is true is that the worker has a business license. Maybe they have an entity in place like an LLC, and different things like that. Maybe they have a DBA if they are a sole proprietor, and that kind of shows that they're not just providing one-off services every once in a while. They're actually doing this routinely as their established trade. And so another way you can look at this is if you are the only person that only entity that this worker is working for, that's probably going to lean closer to employee because that's not independent from you. Basically, if they lost work with you, they would lose everything. So that's not really independent of you. But if they have other customers, they have other clients, other people they're working with, that's going to look a lot more like they're independently established, and that's going to lead toward independent contractor. So as you can see, no clear-cut line. Like I said, there's just that scale of, okay, well, which side does it lean closer to? And this is actually a great time for me to mention that it's going to be pretty hard for us to answer certain questions at the end of this, just because this is a super fact-specific inquiry, and it takes a lot of detail to be able to figure out how every worker falls on this sliding scale. So we're going to answer questions at the end, but if you do have more specific questions, we have free consultations and you can book one and we can go over some of your specifics with you if we're not able to answer them today. Okay. And so from there, a lot of people have questions of, okay, well, I've heard that AB5 has exemptions, and exemptions mean that I don't have to use that ABC test. Is that true? Yes, it is true. If you fit into one of the exemptions that's in AB5, you can potentially bypass the ABC test and use a different test. I'll get into that in just a minute, but I do want to say that the exemptions are, for lack of a better word, really poorly written. They're really awful. And I say that because they're very, in some places they're very narrow, and other places they're way too broad to understand what could potentially fit under there. So for example, fine artist, number 3, that one is super broad and it's technically not defined in the text of the law. So a lot of artists, a lot of creatives are thinking that they can go ahead and use that exemption, but we're seeing more and more that fine artists probably means people that are displaying their art in galleries for truly just aesthetics. And if there's any kind of utilitarian aspect to it, fine artist is probably not going to be the right exemption for that particular type of creative. So an example there would be if you create furniture, because that's a utilitarian object, you might not be a fine artist. If you teach art classes, that's more of a functional type of art and less an aesthetic type of art. So that one's super broad. This is how we've seen fine artists, defined in other government code sections. So that's what we've been going off of, but there's no clarity there. Similarly, graphic designers, that there are a lot of professions that could maybe fall under that, but not super clear. But then there are other ones that are really specific, like still photographers and photojournalists, writers, editors, and cartoonists. And those are not only specific in that they are very clear professions, they also have this licensing limit where these exemptions require that if you want to use the exemption, you can only license 35 times or less to a hiring entity per year. And that really is just, the idea behind that is if you're licensing more than that, that seems like very repetitive routine work, which is more in line with what an employee would do. So that's the idea there. But the 35 times, we're not quite sure where they got that number. It's a very rigid number and we're not sure why they chose it. So I don't know there. But these are the current exemptions. These 5 are the really clear exemptions specifically for creatives. Other than that, there are 2 other potential exemptions. Excuse me. I think I might be missing a slide, but we're gonna wing it. So the big loophole is one of the other exemptions that creatives can use potentially, but it's not specific to creatives. And that's the business to business exemption. And this seems to be the exemption that Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez is referencing when she says sole proprietors and LLCs can be contractors. I mention Assemblywoman Gonzalez because she was the sponsor of AB5. So that means she was pretty much the person that got everything together and roped in everybody who was going to write it. And she was basically the supervisor, I guess we could call it that. So she seems to reference this one because she's done quite a few interviews where she says people who are LLCs can still be independent contractors. People who are nonprofits can still be independent contractors. And this is the only exemption that explicitly mentions LLCs and different types of entities. So this is what we think she's getting at. But the important thing to note here is that this exemption, unlike the other ones I mentioned, has the actual exemption heading itself. And then underneath that, you have to meet several other factors to be able to use this exemption. And that's important because if you meet all of the factors for the exemption, that moves you out of ABC test land into the previous test, which was called the Borello test. And that's important because the Borello test has a lot of factors. Unlike ABC, which is only 3 factors, the Borello test is anywhere from 11 to 13 factors. I say 11 to 13 because sometimes they get condensed into 11, but I believe the EDD's website still has 13 factors listed. So obviously that's very, very different than the ABC test. And the reason why people want to get to that Borello test, that 13 factor test, is because that sheer amount of factors makes it a lot more flexible. There's a lot more to look at. And unlike the ABC test where we're using this sliding scale of, oh, well, are they an independent contractor or are they an employee? We don't look at the Borello factors in the same way. The Borello factors are weighed against each other. So ABC, we weigh them individually, and if any one leans closer to employee, you're pretty much done. Borello's not like that. If you have 2 of the 13 Borello factors that lean toward employee, you can still potentially make that person an independent contractor because we still have the other factors. So people really like getting to Borello if you can because of that flexibility. So any of those creative exemptions I covered, if you can meet those, you go back to Borello. And if you can get through the business to business exemption, you can also get back to Borello. It's kind of like,
real quick.
Yeah.
So I think this is a lot of information and a lot of exemptions, and I'm fielding some of the questions in the chat, and I want to clarify real quick. So yeah, so when we're talking about exemptions with regard to AB5, essentially the way you have to look at it is it's a multi kind of layered or multi-tiered analysis. And when we talk about exemptions, we're talking about ways you can get out of using the ABC test, meaning that you're in one of the other tiers or one of the other layers as its own type of test within that layer. So essentially, when you look at any of these exemptions that Liv has on the screen now, they have their own specific test that falls outside of applying the ABC test, the 3 factors we showed you before. for instance, still photographers and then the writers, editors, cartoonists, that 35 times. That's one factor of the test for that specific exemption, meaning that that's a different factor and you don't apply the ABC. The same goes for the business to business exemption. If you can prove that you are a business with multiple clients and you're serving a business to business, sole proprietors included, then you are exempted from the ABC test and you use the original independent contractor test that we've used in California for many years now, which, as Liv mentioned, is more of a sliding scale. It's how many factors weigh in favor of one or the other, versus the ABC test, which is all or nothing. So when we say exemptions, we're saying you get to excuse yourself from using the ABC factors and use a different set of factors, because that's one of the poor pieces of this legislation, is that instead of simplifying only to those three factors, we now have 10 to 20 different categories that have their own factors in addition to the ABC test.
Yes, thanks, Sam. I was trying to navigate over to the chat so I could see them because I couldn't see earlier, and now it's in the middle of my screen. So
I'm writing down the questions. We got them.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna get out of that. All right. Yeah, and it is a lot to take in. Like I said, I'm assuming that a lot of people have some background, but if you have other questions, for sure, drop them in the chat. Okay. So that big loophole, the business to business one, Sam touched on that a little bit. We're going to dive into it a little bit more. The business to business exemption has a bunch of different, I'm going to call them almost like threshold tests. And once you meet those threshold tests, like Sam said, then you can go to the previous classification test, which was the Borello test that I've been speaking about. And that's what people really want to try to do. And so these threshold questions include things like, does the business have a business license? Does the business have a separate location that's separate from where you, the hiring entity, that's what they refer to the person that would be hiring the would-be contractor, they're the hiring entity. Does the hiring entity have a different location? Does the business that's being hired, do they have multiple clients? How do they advertise? There are different questions like that. And so you need to be able to meet those before you can get to Borello. And one of those really important threshold questions is the second bullet. Business service provider is providing services directly to the contracting business rather than to customers of the contracting business. That one can get a little bit confusing just because it's legalese. But basically what it means is you need to be hiring somebody. This is what that business to business means. You need to be hiring this entity to provide the work directly to you rather than you providing their services directly to the clients. So an example I could use here would be, let's say you are hiring an IT person. If you're hiring that IT person to provide services to you, and let's assume you're not an IT business, let's assume you're some sort of creative, just since we're working with creatives. If you hire that IT business to come into your office and maybe set up your Wi-Fi or something like that, they are providing services to you, the business, rather than your clients or customers. But if you hire an IT provider to, I don't know, add on to whatever your services you're offering are, maybe you do graphic design, maybe you create websites for people. If you're hiring this contractor to provide IT services and then you send that person out to your clients as an add-on service, at that point, they're probably going to be closer to the side of providing the services directly to the clients or the customers. I know that was a lot to take in, and I know it's really confusing, and that's why I say, if you have questions, drop them in. If you feel like maybe that this business to business exemption could work for a contractor you're hoping to hire, definitely set up a consultation with us, because it can be hard to run through with hypotheticals, especially when they're not quite specific to you. But I do think that this particular threshold question is one of the trickiest for creatives, at least for the determinations that I've run through. So it's one that I want to keep on people's radar, that there is that distinction that we would look at if you did need to do some sort of classification here.
It really just comes down to, on that point, whether or not the contractor themselves is interfacing directly with the end client. You know, another good example is like any type of creative work that probably resonates with a lot of people on this particular call. You know, if you're engaged by some company or organization to do some work and you actually interface directly and communicate directly and work directly with their clients, their customers, you might be an employee under this particular analysis of AB5.
Yep. Okay. So we're going to leave behind the exemption world for a little bit and kind of just go into current events. What now? Because we've already talked about how there are those few exemptions for creatives, and obviously creatives make a huge chunk of different professions. I think that was 6 exemptions, including business to business, and there are clearly way more professions out there than 6 creative professions. And the Assembly knows that. So Assemblywoman Gonzalez has announced that there will be amendments to the law, but it's tricky because of COVID. She originally said that if they passed, they would go into effect on January 1st, 2021. But she stated that before we went into shelter in place at the beginning of COVID. And at that point, the legislative sessions were put on hold. They were paused like everything else. So there's a likelihood that there might be a delay because of that shutdown. Everything just kind of got put on pause. She's announced that there were specific amendments specifically for that January 1st, 2021, that was related to the writers and photojournalists exemption. But then on top of that, she said there would be other edits, and these edits, she did not say when those would be done by, but those were the amendments for musicians and other professionals in the music industry. So to backtrack, the 2021 change would be in regard to photojournalists and anybody that really is under that 35 cap that we talked about. And then there's another round of amendments for musicians and other professionals in the music industry that we don't have any sort of date on yet. She announced that second one, the musicians and other professionals, in April. I believe it was April 17th. It was literally right at the beginning of COVID. So
it was April 17th, exactly.
See, I'm on it, guys. Okay, so we kind of went over this a little bit. So we were talking earlier about why they picked 35 for those caps. That's something that's been part of one lawsuit that's been, there's a lawsuit to overturn that, because basically the people that have filed that lawsuit have said, why the heck did we pick 35? It's, in their words, arbitrary, capricious, and a violation of the First Amendment. So we've got challenges going through that could potentially change things, even if we don't have any formal amendments going through right away, but again, not sure when that'll happen. And then there have been a couple other initiatives sponsored. I think there might be 2, but they might have consolidated it into one with respect to app-based drivers. So think like Lyft and Uber specifically, but there's a lot of people clearly who are thinking about AB5 all the time and trying to do what they can to overturn it. And then Assemblywoman Gonzalez herself said, this was a year ago at this point, but she said that she anticipates that we'll be working on this for several years. So even for those changes that are slated to be January 1st, 2021, maybe a little bit after that, those hopefully won't be the last changes, but that's kind of a double-edged sword, because that just means, yeah, even if these changes do come, they won't be coming for quite a while. So keep that in mind. There are still things you can do to change the law, but they're going to be a ways out. So we'll pause for questions. I know we have quite a few coming through the chat. So
I'll address a couple of them if you want to try to just get caught up in the chat and then maybe address the questions we already had.
Yeah, so I'm going to pull the chat box up.
Cool. So I'm going to go back. There's a question in the chat from Rona about essentially like splitting up royalties and working with a fellow independent contractor. And there was a follow-up question on that particular question about sort of who needs to have their business licenses in that sort of regard, in that structure. And the thing that I would say to that question is that everyone should have their business license. I suspect that part of the reasoning and the motivation for AB5 legislation was to make people get their business licenses, because it's a very often forgotten filing. And so the answer to any question about, you know, who should have the business license when we're talking about the business to business exemption, everyone. The business should have their business license. That's their own form of compliance that they can get into hot water for. But then each individual contractor should also, even if they're a sole proprietor, have their business license, because it is going to be one of the #1 things that will make this analysis for AB5 much easier to be compliant with. So everybody needs their business license, except for nonprofits. Norma, good question. And there was a question about whether or not performing arts fall under the fine art exemption.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually a very difficult question to answer, because one of the things that highlights how poorly drafted AB5 is the fact that there are not defined terms in AB5. And this is kind of lawyer nerding, but like when you have a statute, you need definitions of terms in order to then make sense of the statutes. And so we actually had to go to a different set of California corporate code to determine what a fine artist was. And so while I'd like to say that performing arts is included in that, the definition that we looked at had a lot to do with the selling of art for fine art. So it may not. And that is a difficult thing, obviously, then, because you don't know where you fall. And that's another reason why, as Liv mentioned, a lot of the changes coming to AB5 are very specific to the creative industry. So that is going to hopefully include fine artists. And if it doesn't, at least hopefully clarify some of the types of music, art, and performances that maybe have now more clarity, so you don't have to wonder if it's fine art or not. Someone had mentioned that factors B and C are contradictory. I can see where you would feel that way. And the way that I like to break down these ABC factors is I'll use us as an example, as a law firm. So I'm guessing at least that nobody on this call is also a law firm. And so if any of you were to hire us as lawyers, we certainly are not going to be under and subject to your control day-to-day, minute-to-minute. So A is fine. B, we certainly are not doing what you do for your work, right? We are not performing, we are not creating art. Maybe we do in our spare time, but that's not why you're hiring us. And so we satisfy B. And then C is actually whether or not we perform those services for others. So B and C are a little bit different in regard to B is very focused on what does the hiring party do? And does that contractor do something different that supplements what the hiring party does, rather than exactly what the hiring party does? And then C is whatever that thing the contractor does under B that isn't what the hiring party does. Do they do that for a living for many other people, or even just one other customer or client? So obviously, we have multiple clients when times are good. And so we would satisfy C as well if we worked for any of you. So I hope that clarifies sort of how B and C can sound a little bit contradictory. And then the other question on the 35 times limit for creative work, whether that's 35 projects or licenses or invoices. Our understanding, and Liv, correct me if I'm wrong on this, my understanding has always been that it is 35 projects. So you may have multiple licenses under that, you may have multiple invoices under that, but it's really going to be sort of specific projects that you work for someone under. So maybe that's the statement of work, maybe that's an individual contract. Now, the reason that I'm not going to go too in depth on that is that is actually one of the things that should be lifted with these amendments that are supposed to be coming down the pipeline, is the 35 times limit. That is actually supposed to be removed. And as Liv mentioned, there's also some legal challenges to that in addition to it hopefully being removed just by amendment as well.
Well, and to jump in here, and this is why I asked that clarifying question for you, Norma, it also depends on what work these people are doing, because let me see if I can go back. Yep. All right. So you'll see that the licensing is only on points 4 and 5. So photographers / photojournalists, writers, editors, or cartoonists. If you have a graphic designer who's creating stuff for you, that 35 time cap is not included on that kind of exemption. It's very specific, and it only falls under those two that we have right there on the screen. So if you, let's use the grant writer. That's a great example. So if you have somebody who's doing grant writing for you, and let's say they do 36 applications. That seems crazy to me, but if they can do it, it doesn't really matter, because this cap does not apply to that particular exemption. So just keep that in mind as well. The 35 number should not scare you if you are not a still photographer, a photojournalist, writer, editor, or cartoonist, because it's not going to apply to you. Okay, so I see invoicing for marketing, photography, and or grant writing. So yeah, so if they're a photographer, that 35 cap is going to apply until those changes are in effect. If they're a photographer, or excuse me, I just said photographer. If they're a grant writer, that 35 is not going to apply whatsoever because it never technically applied to that exemption. And then marketing professionals are also another exemption, and we didn't include that just because usually when we include that, people get move more into the administrative world, less of the creative world. But marketing professional is technically an exemption, and that one doesn't have that cap either. I see, does editor mean only writing? I'm a film. In this case, it does mean for writing. It doesn't mean for film or video, but you may have some limiting language under the still photographers and photojournalists section. I'd need to talk to you a little bit more about what you do, but they do talk a little bit about film and editing in that exemption. Exemptions 4 and 5 here are pretty lengthy. They're about that long when you look at it on the screen, whereas graphic designer, grant writer, and fine artists are literally just that. They're that big compared to the chunk.
And I did want to chime in here with a little bit of a practical point. So I would imagine that a lot of you on this call have experienced loss of different engagements that you had, loss of work as a contractor. And there's a really important distinction that we try to make when we work with clients in our communities about AB5, which is that because AB5 is drafted in the very ambiguous way that it is, a lot of the time you are going to, as a contractor, hear that you're losing a gig, you're losing work, you can no longer be contracted because you have to be an employee. And while that may be the position that the engaging party, the hiring party, whoever it is you were doing the work for, that may be the position that they're taking. The problem, though, is that that is out of an abundance of caution. Maybe they did go through a legal analysis, and maybe it is true that you should be an employee based on the work that you were doing. However, what we're finding is that the majority of the time, companies are taking a very hyper-prudent stance on classification of contractor versus employee because there is so much ambiguity and so much uncertainty around the law that they just cannot risk the potential of an audit. Because, and this is a really good segue into sort of another very important practical point. Yeah, and so what ends up happening in these situations is that there's really 3 main ways that the engaging party would get into trouble here. And that's a super, super important distinction. All of you as freelancers or as actual contractors, 1099s yourselves, the compliance is not on you. You do not bear the burden of compliance. Whoever is hiring you and paying you and using your services, they bear the burden of compliance, which is why there's so much hyper-prudence right now, because all of these companies, if they are built on an independent contractor model, and they're worried that they would be audited by the EDD here in California and then told that they have to put 10, 20, 100 different contractors on the payroll as employees, it would be devastating for them. And so instead, they're taking the prudent step of just not having contractors and only having employees that they're sure or contractors that they're sure, and then they avoid that sort of risk. Now, how they actually get that audit, 3 main ways. One of the contractors themselves leaves and is upset and feels they should have been an employee and gotten their meal breaks and their benefits and so on. And they go to the labor commissioner and they file a complaint about misclassification as a contractor. That's one way that an audit could be triggered. A second is going to be if an audit is triggered due to some other compliance issue. So going back to the business licenses, if that company for some reason doesn't have a business license and that catches up to them, that could cause an audit, and then that audit could spread to whether their classifications are correct for contractors. And then the last one, the kind of bummer one, is competitors. If a competitor sees an organization or a company that is fully independent contractor and they've moved fully to employee, they may blow the whistle on that and cause an audit for that one that has all the contractors. So all of that to say, I hope it's a little bit helpful in clarifying that the burden of compliance is not on any of you as the contractors. But of course, if you are getting pushback about being engaged as a contractor, and hopefully from the knowledge you gain from this call or maybe from our YouTuber working with us, you can maybe help them walk through a better way to be set up and ensure that they have this done as well as it can be. And I say that because it's going to be constantly in flux and it is still very ambiguous. So you really can only do the best you can to make sure that you've done the analysis and tried to make sure things are classified correctly. And of course, as you all as contractors, you have very limited ability to do that with the hiring party that you might be working with.
So Sam jumped into that first bullet point on this page. And I'm just going to run through these real quick, let a few more questions filter through the chat, and then we'll go back to the chat. But these are kind of just FAQs. These are questions we get a lot. So Sam just covered the first one. If you are the contractor, are you at risk for penalties if you're improperly classified? Nope, that's not on you to classify in the first place. So not going to be a risk there unless you are the hiring entity. And then the next two are questions that have just been very context specific since we are still living in a pandemic. The first, what benefits do I have as an independent contractor in the pandemic? That one is in regard to unemployment specifically. We've gotten a lot of questions about that, and the Federal CARES Act, which went into effect at the very beginning of the pandemic, makes it so that you can apply for unemployment if you've lost work. And you may be eligible for relief under the next round of stimulus funds if those get passed. There's been some talk from different people that bills would be going through. There was that second one that I believe the Democrats pushed through and then was rejected by the Republicans in Congress. But so they are keeping independent contractors kind of in that conversation of who will get more protection, I guess, under federal legislation during the pandemic. So CARES Act, you do have unemployment benefits under for sure. So I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about that. I've definitely heard of people applying to the EDD and having issues and other people going through really seamlessly. I think it really just depends on when you applied. So if you applied early on and you were rejected, you might think about applying again just because they hadn't worked out all the kinks between the old system, which didn't include independent contractors, and the new system, which does. So that's kind of my little spiel on unemployment for the CARES Act. And then, will unemployment relief as an independent contractor trigger a government tax audit? We got that question recently, and there's no clear-cut answer right now. It's possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's probable. And the reason why I say that is just because of the sheer amount of people that are taking advantage of this new option. The unemployment rate, I know it's very high. I don't know what it is as of today, but there's just too many people right now applying for different benefits that this would be something that you would need to worry about before applying for things. If you need the unemployment, apply for the unemployment. Okay, and then okay, so we have some more coming through the chat, so we'll stop there for a minute. Yeah, Rona, I think you're right. The HEROES Act was that one I was thinking of that is just sitting there. And then Sam answered Beck's question, which was a great question. All right, so if we don't have any other questions right now, I'm gonna move forward with what you can do. So Keep Speaking Up is probably the biggest and most immediately doable thing that you can do. Sorry, I just kicked my desk. So call and write to your legislators. We have a lot of people who are rallying behind their industry's lobbyists, but even if you don't have a lobbyist for your industry, you can call, you can write. A lot of these legislators are taking this very seriously. Others are kind of being peer pressured. So I would say just keep doing what you need to do. You can even point out other exemptions that are analogous to what you do. So for example, we know now that they're already looking at changes for the music industry. Maybe you are in dance. Dance can be very similar in a lot of ways to how music is. The music exemption specifically talks about, well, what if we're doing one-off performances? Dancers can do that. Same for maybe you're doing a local community production of theater. You know, that's only one week, maybe 2 weeks. It's not something you do year round. Different things like that where you can make the analog. You can say, why does that industry get an exemption, or why are they being considered for an exemption? My industry is very similar. That would be one way that you could write. So I know that that's how people have been doing it. And I really do think that that's how the music industry and the writing and photojournalists and all of those capped industries, I think that that's how they've been able to kind of get what they want by pointing out that it's really been arbitrary how these exemptions have been determined.
And I will say too that Lorena Fletcher Gonzalez, despite the fact that she is, for lack of a better word, quite crass on social media with her responses to people that criticize this bill, she has been pretty receptive to feedback and requests as to how to change this legislation. And I would say too, I'm certainly a part of a few Facebook groups and other groups that are, you know, the torches are lit for this bill and for Lorena Fletcher Gonzalez herself. And I would say that I 100% understand everyone's frustration and anger and vitriol in this matter because of how much work it has cost people. But, you know, I think that she is doing her best, and I'm sure Liv is probably surprised that I'm coming to the defense of Lorena, but she did try to do this for reasons that were, by all intents and purposes, looked like they were to help the California economy and actually to help protect independent contractors that were improperly classified. Of course, we know in practice that the impact has been absolutely detrimental and you know, by far and away negative. But, you know, I would say that try to reach out, like Liv said. This is one of those instances where I think right now, mostly Lorena's cabinet and the people that she works with and her aides probably would welcome feedback and requests on AB5 instead of probably all of the comments and questions and requests that they're getting related to COVID and our economy right now. So I would say definitely this is the time to contact your representative and her specifically, and also other people in our state legislature, because there are people that have fallen on one side or the other on this. And I unfortunately don't think it's going anywhere. Even Biden has started to speak about AB5. So the goal is to make it work for all of us and make it work for all of you. And the way to do that is to get in touch with your representatives for sure.
Yes, definitely. All right, so we already went through some of the questions. I'm going to minimize my screen now. We're going to go through some more questions. I see there's some coming through chat, and I'm going to put that disclaimer up real quick before I exit out. I'm also going to drop in the chat once I minimize my screen. I'm going to drop the link that's for Assemblywoman Gonzalez's press release page, and that's a really good resource because anytime she talks about AB5, it ends up on that press release page. So you can bookmark it, you can check it, you know, every week. It's going to be specific to everything that she is spearheading within the legislature. So it's not just going to be AB5, but she's had a few in there in the last few months. So like I said, it's just a very direct line to what she's saying. All right. Okay. So Sam, do you want to start with the questions, and I'm just going to pull that link really quick?
Sure. I'm going to try to go back up and find the best or the most recent question that we have not addressed. So I think that's going to be the question from Christine about, oh no, that's just actually a vote for AB5 being to protect people, which was the intent. How it has impacted us is different. And then there was a question about having a letter for an independent contractor that basically states that that person was hired to do contract work. What I would say there is that an independent contractor agreement is going to be a really, really important thing to have in place in all of these situations. And we look at that sort of two ways. If we are working for you and you are a contractor and you're going to provide services, we would recommend that you have something called a client services agreement. Now, this is going to be something that's helpful in all of the conversations with AB5, but more importantly, it's going to be something that helps protect you and sets parameters on the work that you do for your clients. So it's kind of a twofer there, because you also then have an agreement that really helps protect the relationship and structure it well for yourself. But then the other way we look at that is if we're working for an entity, company, organization, what have you, and they need to contract out, we would recommend that they have an independent contractor agreement for their contractors. And of course, now you could see where those two might conflict at some point if both have their own agreement. But there are different motivations for each of those agreements being differently drafted, because there's different protections and needs for if you're hiring a contractor versus if you're a contractor providing services. And so that's kind of a long way of answering. Instead of a letter, I would have an agreement in place. And then there's a question, another question from Christine, I think this might be a different Christine, on a lot of theater work that's pretty low hourly rate. Yeah, and whether it'd be better to be classified as an employee. You know, that question's kind of hard to answer without a little bit more of the specifics, but If you're doing theater work for more than one theater, I think you probably fall in that business-to-business exemption. Grab yourself a business license just to make sure. If it is all for one theater, then probably better to be an employee, and that might even mean a boost in your pay, because once you're an employee land, there are minimums as far as minimum wage, salary, things like that, which kind of goes back to sometimes this can actually be better for contractors.
I saw Norma's just venting about Lyft, Uber, and other mega businesses. You're absolutely right. And that's really who Assemblywoman Gonzalez has pretty much made it clear that AB5 was supposed to go after. And then I think it was just one of those things where she realized we can't just go after Lyft. We have to make this more comprehensive, or else it's going to get struck down, or people won't be on board with it. But either way, people are still not really on board with it. But there have been a lot of, I think the most recent press release on that page I sent over was actually about Lyft and Uber. She's made it pretty clear that that's what AB5 was supposed to be all about. Okay, I'm just going through the rest of these. Okay. I see Norma asked, can we provide you with a template? Unfortunately, we can't just provide you with a template. We have to.
Chat too.
What'd you say?
I just answered that in the chat too, but go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, we can't provide you just with a template, unfortunately, because we have certain rules that we have to abide by, and we can't give we can give legal information, but we can't give legal advice, and that would probably fall under advice. So if you need a template, I would recommend having a consultation with us, and then we'll see what we can do.
And we tend to not provide sort of blanket templates.
Yeah.
It's kind of like providing a loaded gun without training. And I know it's kind of a triggering example right now, and I'll come up with a better one soon. But yeah, it's dangerous to give someone a template that's not very much catered to their circumstances.
Okay, I'm looking at Beck's question. If we are hiring someone as an independent contractor and they pass the ABCs, but they're on an F1 student visa, do you know what form we need from them, how we file that? Yeah, that is a specific question. We don't do immigration specifically, so I don't want to give you an answer that's maybe only half right. So that would be something definitely, that's a consultation question, I think.
And it's also important to kind of highlight that I think two things with both of these questions here that are in the chat. So, you know, as far as like a student visa, there's been a lot of questions we've gotten over the 2 years now that this has been at play about whether or not, if the contractor is based in California or based outside of California, whether the company is based in California or outside of California. And it's sometimes hard to answer those questions. Obviously, a student visa, if they're residing in California, my guess is that they are going to be lumped in with AB5, and you would need to file any of the appropriate employment paperwork for that student visa if you are going to employ them. If it is just that they're a contractor, they would probably need to figure out what tax forms they need to file on their end. And then that next question there, the 3 to 4 times a year to install and deinstall shows. I think there's two things I want to address here in this question. One, that doesn't sound like you should be switched to an employee. Yeah. That sounds, yeah, I mean, if it's a theater and they hire you, or a museum and they hire you, install and you know, deinstall is not a substantial function of the museum. You could make an argument, I guess, that it is, but most likely not. So you would be a contractor. And that's also the danger here with AB5, is that people might be incentivized to make everyone an employee. And there are going to be situations where you should be a contractor. It's better for you, it's better for the company, and it fits within AB5 as far as compliance goes. So be very careful not to be sort of motivated to become an employer, motivated to make people employees just out of the fear of AB5. If you're able to satisfy AB5's exemptions or its tests, people can stay contractors, and that might be better for everyone involved.
I will say, though, for the 3 to 4 times a year, I'm not 100% sure how long that takes to do an install and a deinstallation. So if that takes you several months and it's 3 to 4 times a year, and that's pretty much your whole year, and maybe that is one of 2 people you work for, that might be a different story. So that's why we say it's really fact specific, because 3 to 4 times a year for one profession might look different than 3 to 4 times a year for a different one. And there are going to be some people who are independent contractors that want to be employees, and there are going to be people who don't want to be employees. So it really depends on what camp you fall in, how you can navigate ABC, and lots of different issues. So that's why we say, if you do have an actual specific question, it's not just a hypothetical, take advantage of the 30-minute consultation because we can dive into the specifics. Oh, Rona's question is about partnerships, it looks like.
That one will relate a little bit to how you pay each other. So if you're truly operating as 50-50 partners, one way to potentially avoid any AB5 considerations is if you have a partnership agreement in place.
Mm-hmm.
If you're functioning as partners within an LLC and both of you are owners of the LLC, you would not have to deal with AB5 amongst the two of you. But if, I think as you had mentioned earlier, Rona, if you receive payment and then you pay out your partner on particular projects, the partnership in the 50-50 terminology may just be that. It may just be terminology, because the way that that money flows, if you're paid and technically then your partner is a subcontractor of yours, again, that'll be sort of how the taxes are done, how the payments are made, and sort of how it's structured, because that's really the backstop to all of this is, you know, who files the 1099? How do you guys file your taxes? How do the payments flow from one to another? And that's really where the government would look as sort of the supporting evidence of whether or not you're partners or paying each other as contractors.
I've got a link coming for David's question, so give me 1 second on that, but you can maybe jump to the next couple questions.
Sure.
Okay.
As far as consultations go, that one's easy. You can just go to our website and click on my face actually in the bottom corner, and then you can reach out to us there. And then also, if you want to email us, the email is Bertie, BERTIE @InBetterWeTrust.com. I think it's in the chat, and I'll put it there if not. Bertie is our imaginary hedgehog mascot, and you can email him and he'll get you all set up for a consultation. Bertie, he's the better hedgehog. I don't know. We like alliteration. So part-time employee question. I'm not sure how that relates. Oh, so with the 1 month and the install and deinstall, yeah, I mean, a part-time employee, there's just difficulty with employment because it has to be regular and there has to be regular paychecks. So if it's 1 month at a time, I still think that sounds like it probably weighs more in favor of a contractor than a part-time employee, unless, of course, you are doing work for them part-time in between the months when you are installing or deinstalling.
I just dropped Bertie in there, and then
I'm pretty sure I dropped the YouTube link in the chat earlier, but we're certainly happy to provide that again too, because we have, I think, close to 80 videos on there now, and there's probably, I don't know, 15 related to AB5, one of which we actually took an interview of Lorena and cut it up to actually show her saying, if you're a sole proprietor and you have your business license, you totally satisfy the business-to-business exemption. She said it like 4 times in the interview. So that's not just from us. That's from the author herself.
We'll send, Sam and Olivia, we will send a follow-up email to everybody, and we'll include a copy of the recording. We'll include the copy of the slides. We'll include the YouTube link, Bertie's email address, and anything else that comes up that folks are asking for.
Great. Thank you.
Any information on dance exemptions? So there currently, Michael, there currently aren't any explicit exemptions for dance. So if that's something that you are looking for, that would be one reason to call your legislators, because like I said, we're getting these new exemptions on music. Dance could be similar. You can make that argument.
Yeah, and Gretchen, your question is a very difficult one. We have seen a lot of questions that are very similar to that, which is this sort of difficult aspect where, first of all, you know, there's a nonprofit organization and the type of work that it does is probably pretty broad. You know, in addition to the classes that you may teach for them, the overall mission of the organization is probably more of like art awareness or just spreading art. And so it may not necessarily be a teaching organization per se, meaning that maybe factor B isn't present if you're doing teaching services for that organization. And those are the ones where we really have to look at the factors and sort of go through the legislation and the statute itself, because we really have to make sort of two determinations, right? One is whether or not the factor B is satisfied, which means we have to determine what the hiring party does in the first place, which is going to be a matter of debate, right? I think in any situation, part of what an organization or a business would try to do if they were audited is argue what their specific business purpose is, so that they can then argue that a contractor falls outside of it and isn't performing substantially the same services. And so with nonprofit organizations, that's tough, because at least most of the nonprofit organizations that we work with, they provide a number of different types of programming. There might be classes, there might be awareness campaigns, there might be events, there might be, you know, products. There's all kinds of things that they do. And it's very difficult sometimes to say, okay, well, there is a programming that's all teaching artists, and those people are actually artists normally, but now they're working for the organization in a teaching capacity. And so you can see where these things kind of get very, very specific to the factors. And, you know, I think a lot of the time with nonprofit organizations, well, and businesses as well, I think the other practical point that we like to make, and by no means are we saying, hey, just roll the dice on non-compliance, but there is an important sort of distinction here that depending on the revenue of the hiring party, because remember, where the flags would get raised and who would be in the, you know, the burden of compliance is the hiring party. The lower their sort of operating revenue and their sort of operating account on an annual basis is, the less they are on the radar of the enforcement actions for these types of things, especially right now when the crosshairs are on the Ubers and the Lyfts and the DoorDash.
And just to piggyback on that, if it wasn't clear, nonprofits don't get a pass. We get that question a lot. Do nonprofits fall under AB5? They absolutely do. So if you're a nonprofit and you're hiring, you still have to abide by the rules from AB5. Okay,
Liv, if you want to address that first Christine question, I'll address the second one.
Let me read through it real quick. Okay. Is it based on? So, Christine, I'm looking at your question. So it looks like we're talking about multiple theaters. When you're a designer at some theaters, working for bigger theaters as a technician. I wouldn't say that it needs to be consistent if you are doing different things, because if you're a designer for one and you're a technician for another, that's technically two different roles. That's like if I decided I wanted to be a lawyer by day and moonlight as something else, you know, they're distinct. And I also think that it's going to be important to look at who's hiring you. If you had one theater hiring you as both a designer and a tech, one as a 1099 and one as a W-2, that would be an issue. So is it based on each individual job? I would actually say it's just based on the situation. It's going to look different for different people depending on what's being done. And to Sam's point, you're also going to have situations where sometimes people are more comfortable with you being an employee, and other situations where they're like, whatever, be a 1099, we don't really care. So that can also determine what you should be at any given time. It's just how people are willing to hire you.
Yeah, and Gretchen, I know you're not the only person in organization tearing your hair out over this bill. But what I would say to that too is that in a lot of these situations, and given the context that we provided about sort of practically speaking how you would get hit with a misclassification audit and action here, you know, in that situation, I would say that if all of your teaching artists that, you know, it's 4 sessions, you know, maybe once per quarter, if they prefer to be contractors and you all are in the sort of understanding and knowledgeable about that it could go one way or the other in a classification, in those situations, sometimes it's better to defer to the contractors and sort of do what they prefer to be. And if any of them want to be employees, you know, certainly then look at what it would look like to employ them. There's also the concept of seasonal employees and temporary employees that sometimes can be utilized as an in-between step from contractor to full employment or full part-time employment if it is going to be something that's of a temporary duration.
I'm reading Sam's question, Sam Roseman. Yes, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, you can have a hodgepodge of both. If you are a W-2 and a 1099 for the same organization, that can get dicey and probably not recommended. But you could certainly be a W-2 over here for something and then a 1099 over here for something else, or even the same type of work, 2 different entities or organizations. That's doable.
And one thing that I don't think we addressed it. Christine Marie had that question about the DBA and that fictitious, and the business license. And Sam, I saw that you answered some of it. One thing I do want to just clarify really quickly is that the business license itself is not the exemption. It's part of some of the exemptions, as like we were talking about how there are those multiple thresholds in some of those exemptions cases where you have to hit a bunch of different marks before you can utilize the exemption. On some of those, business license is one of those threshold things, but a business license in itself is not an exemption.
Right. It is a helpful filing that you would have that satisfies a single factor of many under the business exemption.
Yeah. So just to clarify.
Yeah. And I mean, if anybody out there is watching this and you guys are like, oh, I'm so confused, I really have no idea what's going on, you're not alone. And we try our best to make this stuff very clear. And that's why I would also recommend checking out the YouTube channel, because those are videos where we, had a little bit of a script and we tried to make it as succinct as possible. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes on these, when we're answering the questions, we might ramble a little bit. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there's really, in a lot of situations, no clear answer here. And it really comes down to sort of your risk aversion threshold as far as if you're the hiring party, or your preference if you're the contractor, and sort of what both parties can settle on as far as what works financially, economically, and then in compliance. Because I would say that, by and large, there is probably still the majority of our industries in California operating under an independent contractor model, despite the fact that AB5 is actual legislation and law. And I think that that's partially due to COVID, but I think more so due to the fact that a lot of people are really just willing to take a calculated risk on this if the situation they have is really working for everyone and no one seems to want to make a change to it.
Yep. And I think the questions are wrapping up, but these were really great questions. I'll probably steal a couple of them for the FAQ for the next presentation.
Which our next AB5 presentation, I think, is
end of July.
And then I think we have one about a week after that in August. So we've got a few more AB5 workshops coming up that if there are updates, changes, comments, amendments between now and then, the substance of our presentations will change. If not, we'll probably be covering a lot of what we've covered now and answering questions similarly to what we did today.
That's excellent. Well, Sam and Olivia, I want to thank you today for facilitating our talk. We really appreciate your time and your willingness to share your expertise with us. And I'd also like to thank all of the CalArtians who have tuned in to the presentation. We will send a copy of the slides, the recording of our talk, the YouTube link to the AB5 channel that you all have created. So everybody just has the follow-up materials and can review things at their own pace. And I just hope everyone has a great rest of your day and to see you all at our next virtual program. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Have a good one.